Bitcoin's decoupling from stocks. What's it telling you?
Look, I think without a doubt, the last 3 weeks have been painful. We've seen 1.5x times higher volatility in the last 3 weeks than we've seen in 2025 total. And a lot of that has to do with a number of things. One, there's implications, outside of just macro, which is, more global and geopolitical. And we're seeing a lot of bit of that. We're also seeing, some decoupling into the weekend, where we are seeing sell-offs into the weekend and then buybacks back into Monday, as you referenced earlier. And then last, we're seeing rotations back into, macro. And so, for example, sometimes people have to sell off their risk assets in order to reposition into those macro assets. And I think that's what we're seeing a little bit here as well.
The data set that keeps flashing up on the Bloomberg terminal, Caroline did it in the news story belt earlier, is the ETF flows, outflows at the moment. I'm just trying to use that data set to understand the psychology of everyone that participates in this industry. What is the interpretation we should make?
Yeah, so look, I think more broadly, Bitcoin operates in 4-year cycles, and we're seeing that 2025 is actually more similar to a 2021 or 22 in comparison to a 2020, 23, and 24. And what's tough is, in those years, we really saw a strong December, especially. And, you had the post-halving liquidity surge, you had recovery from FTX, and ETF optimism. And then in 24, you saw the ETF, inflows coming in size. And so, we've seen this cycle before. We've also seen historically this year a lot of very long-term holders take some profits off the table. And we have seen some patience. And so I think you're seeing some of that profit taking into year end. We're going to continue to see that. But it really does make Q1 look very attractive as we do close out on that 4-year cycle. And we have a lot of the headwinds that will take us there, whether it's the Vanguard news, whether it's the Bank of America news. We are looking to see new entrants come into the market via the ETFs.
Talking of long-term holders selling, there was suddenly a shock to the system when it was thought that maybe Michael Saylor's strategy, artist formerly known as MicroStrategy, might actually offload Bitcoin. The hodler of all hodlers sort of saying the most extraordinary thing to many who've been in this market for a long time. What did you make of that and their desire to try and stabilize after that moment?
Look, I think at the end of the day, he is probably feeling some of the pressure that some of these other institutional players are feeling, which is diversification and having to manage some of that downside risk. And if you do have leverage, having to manage your margin calls. And so at the end of the day, was that a great headline for the space? No, of course not. But these things operate in cycles, and we are at the end of that cycle that also was announced before the Vanguard news and before the Bank of America news. And so, I think there are, again, headwinds into Q1, but I agree with you. I think, looking at where we are and then the next 3 weeks into year end, it's probably not going to be as optimistic, but means that 2026 can start that news cycle over again.
I'm probably going to take most of the rest of the year off, just share that with the audience. And so it might be my last chance to ask you for your 2026 predictions. This year has kind of been about stablecoin legislation, David Sachs, dollarization. If you were to listen to Jamie Dimon, he will always bring it back to the underlying technology and the utility of blockchain in global financial markets. What do you think will happen next in 2026?
Look, I think what people haven't realized yet is tokenization of everything is happening. And it started with stablecoins, as you mentioned, but it's going much broader than that. So if you look at even equities trading on chain, you saw the Mag 7 come to Hyperliquid. That was, following NVIDIA's earnings, one of the largest days of volume for Hyperliquid in November. And so you're seeing a lot of that come on chain, and you're also seeing a lot of traditional assets get tokenized. And so, we're seeing on our side a lot of tokenization of assets, strategies, vehicles, and then the liquid markets to make them composable and more capital efficient.